Hello and welcome everyone to this AMA. My name is Andreas Lenkig and I'm here with Aaron Powell, and we're going to be doing a remote talk about VS Code, following on from Aaron Powell's talk this morning. Aaron Powell, how are you?
This is WTV today, and I'm excited to continue talking and sharing the excitement about VS Code and all things related to that.
Of course. There was so much information in the talk. Visual Studio Code is such a deep, got to scratch the surface.
Yeah, indeed. I reckon I probably only covered maybe like a third of the things you can do with VS Code, and I can't speak more highly of it as an editor, and I've used a lot of different ones over the years. It's just, yeah, I really find it so useful for so many different things.
Fantastic. So speaking on that, these different editors, I mean, I've noticed that, we have Visual Studio Code, which is this great open source editor with a bunch of powerful extensions and plugins that you can do, super lightweight. And we have Visual Studio, which is also powerful. It's been around for quite a while. But when I'm speaking to other developers around the office and in the community, people tend to have kind of a front-end mindset when they're looking at Visual Studio Code, and when they're doing back-end development, they look at Visual Studio. Can you speak a bit about why we can't be doing everything in Visual Studio Code and why the mindset might be how it is?
Well, I think one of the reasons is probably what you touched on there, is that Visual Studio has been around for so long, and so many people are used to it, are familiar with it, and it works really well for a lot of scenarios. I was a Visual Studio user for the longest time. I remember like the first few versions of Visual Studio and using those, and the excitement as releases came out, so on, like over the years. For me, one of the reasons why I saw a transition more towards using Visual Studio Code was that I started doing more and more web development and not needing some of the more, I guess, sort of advanced tools that Visual Studio has to offer. Things like database tooling. Like I didn't need to use that, and so I didn't need that out of an editor, whereas I can see that being a really useful thing for a lot of applications, particularly building like end-tier .NET applications. Probably the other thing is that Visual Studio Code doesn't lend itself to every single sort of problem. It's very difficult to do a WPF application or like a Windows desktop application from VS Code, because you don't have that same rich editor experience for the design surface, doing control layouts and stuff like that. So I think VS Code fits very nicely for that front end mindset where everything is just, it's code files, it's HTML, it's CSS. That's what you're looking at. You don't need drag and drop editors and stuff like that. Whereas things that lend themselves better to that paradigm tend to fit better into like the full Visual Studio experience. Something I do like though is the kind of overlap that we're starting to see with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. Extensions like Live Share, where we can create a remote collaborative environment, we can do that, and we can use VS or VS Code, depending what your tool of choice is. And even if you're debugging a Node application remotely, I can do that from full Visual Studio, whereas the other person might be on VS Code.
You showed some very powerful features of live share in the talk you did earlier, where you had even the person who was partnering and sharing in could access the local host of the source presenter's machine, which was absolutely astounding. Yeah.
That is drastically underappreciated in the industry at the moment. Like, the fact that I can start up a live share experience from my machine and then share out that link to anyone that I want to have joining, whether it's someone that's pair programming, whether it's a colleague I'm asking to help me debug a problem, or I've actually done small workshops where I've shared out my editor over live share to the attendees of the workshops, so that they don't have to rely on maybe like a choppy video coming over your video conferencing application screen share. They can actually just load up the editor themselves and follow around in the code base. I think like that kind of thing really makes it so much easier, particularly at the moment where we're all having to work from home. We can't sit together in a classroom to do a workshop, or we can't sit with our peers and pair program, debug through problems together. we can do that without relying on just like a video conferencing application where you're watching someone and you're struggling to articulate how you want them to navigate around the editor. I just want to explore myself, but I can't reach over and grab your mouse.
No, but with this you really can. You can like follow people around as they switch their cursor. You can see where they're selecting and a bunch of crazy features there. It really makes this remote work that we're all forced into work so much better now. I know I've used it a fair amount in the past few months while I've been paired programming with other team members.
I actually was talking to a couple of the other speakers. There's a group this afternoon. I think there's 3 of them doing a talk. And I said, well, why don't you use live share so you don't have to keep swapping who's screen sharing? So I'm going to dial into their talk to see if they are going to give that a crack so that they can have 3 people co-present a talk, but only one person has to screen share. And I think that's kind of like other interesting ways that we can tackle technology.
For sure. You mentioned kind of part of live sharing is debugging. And one thing you said you didn't get a chance to talk about earlier this morning was how we can do debugging in Visual Studio Code.
Yeah, so it's got a really rich debugging experience, and it can debug pretty much every language that I've ever needed to come across, whether it's Python or .NET, JavaScript through Node. You can even there's even extensions available for VS Code that allow you to connect to your web browser, so whether that's Chrome or Firefox or Microsoft Edge, and instead of using the browser dev tools to do like debugging of script files when they're running, you can actually use VS Code. So you can think of it like you're starting a full stack web application, whether it's running Node or .NET or whatever it is as the server component, and then like a React front end. Well, rather than having like one half of your application you debug in a browser and another half you're debugging in Visual Studio Code, now you just like you can do it all from VS Code. So yeah, I think like that kind of thing really makes it so much simpler when you're trying to teach someone and trying to get up and running with something. It's like, well, now you've got to learn shortcut keys in the browser versus the shortcut keys that you've got with inside of your editor. No, we'll just put it all in one location.
Yeah, that was actually something I wanted to follow up on. So there's actually an extension you can get which pulls in the web dev tools from Chrome or Edge into Visual Studio Code.
Yeah. So Edge, Chrome, and Firefox, they're available. I don't know. Are there any other browsers that we concern ourselves with at the moment? I haven't seen whether Safari has got it, but it's because there's an open standard to the way that the debugging protocol works across browsers, so we can just connect in from VS Code. And yeah, that's something that I use when I'm doing my web development, and I don't have to worry about 2 different sets of tool chains that I'm working with.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of also that whole debugging experience and expanding your power in Visual Studio Code. You mentioned in the talk tasks. So this is one thing that I thought was quite interesting. You had an example of creating a templated Markdown file based on a blog post. What are some of the other use cases you can use? Well, one thing that came to mind is perhaps you could set up like a database migration where you can run it out of a task.
Yep. Yeah, so think about tasks as like if there's something that you can run from a shell, whether it's PowerShell or Bash or whatever it might be, you can do that as a task, and then it's just a keyboard shortcut away for it being executed. So yeah, the example that I used was that I create blog posts, but yeah, your example there, where if you're doing .NET and using like the EF migrations tool, like you could just have a task where you just like run that and it's going to run the appropriate script command. Or if you're working with maybe like an Angular application where it's got some tooling around how you scaffold out new files or new services and stuff like that, you can have a task that just does that. So yeah, I've seen it used for a lot of things like that. Whether it's scaffolding new files, whether it's doing something as simple as running the compile step of a .NET application. Like you can still do that. But yeah, I wanted to expand people's minds around what else you can do. It's not just a way that you can run .NET Build and .NET Restore and things like that.
How easy is it to get into these tasks? Is it as simple as pointing the task at a script that you have in the project?
Yeah, so tasks have there's a couple of different like things that can contribute. Extensions can contribute like styles of tasks. So like .NET will contribute a style of task where it understands some of the semantics around how you do the .NET command line tooling. Similar like Node and NPM, they can also provide like helping starting points there. But then something otherwise, it's just like, well, I want to execute this in a shell. Here's the script file that I want you to run, or just like a loose command that you want to execute. And then you can have maybe like an override. If you're on Mac, you're going to execute a bash script, whereas on Windows, it's going to be a PowerShell script. And you can have those sorts of overrides. You can even have them with what we call problem matches inside of VS Code. Whereas if you're getting some output from it, say it's running like a TypeScript compilation step, and that's got a chance of the compilation failing. So you want those that bit of information to be available within inside of your editor, so you can jump through to those lines to fix it. Well, Problem Matcher can take a regex that says, well, here's the line and how you break down that error message to inject it into the problems list within inside of VS Code, so you can then jump through to that file quite easily. But common ones like TypeScript and .NET, those are provided by the appropriate extensions for VS Code. So you don't have to write the regexes all yourself.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, some of these features, I wonder, what's the best way to learn them? You mentioned that there's a reference that you can go to read up on the shortcut and those sort of things. But is there maybe like a gamified resource where you could go through and really commit these things to memory?
So the first place I would tell people to start with is on the Visual Studio docs, there is a tips and tricks section where it's a massive long document that covers off a lot of stuff similar to what I was talking about in the presentation earlier at NDC of here's common shortcuts that you should learn, or here's how you use tasks and launch settings to start the debugger. Here's how you navigate around the editor, all the way through to some of the advanced stuff in there. So that would be the first place that I recommend anyone that wants to learn how to get the most out of VS Code as an editor. Jump into there.
Yeah, fantastic. One thing I noticed is you went through so many, at the very beginning, you went through so many different features and shortcuts and stuff like that. Now, some of the favorite features, one you didn't mention, which is when you're creating new files, Visual Studio actually allows you to create directories at the same time by using a slash notation. So if you wanted to create a file two directories deep, you can go folder1/folder2/text.txt, which is really absolutely just makes it really simple and easy to use.
Yeah, funnily enough, I actually had that in my notes and completely missed it. But that's another one of those really underrated features. Until you realize that it's there, you don't realize that you were missing an editor that had that. Where, instead of like right-click, new folder, right-click, new folder, right-click, new file, you just create the full path with directory separators in it, hit enter, and it will go, well, if the folder already exists, it's going to just put it in that folder. If it doesn't, it'll create the pathing for you, which, when I learned that one, I'd been using VS Code for a long time before I learned that one, and I was like, oh, wow, how did I not know about this before?
It's so useful. And there's so much, I think, that you try and convince people, the mouse actually slows you down, that they don't really get until they start to make use of these features, that you can really just power up your workflow by getting your hand away from the mouse and onto the keyboard and stopping that motion of, okay, let me just get it over here and use a separate tool with the mouse and click around. But getting everything in on the keyboard just makes things so much easier in the long run.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I wanted to encourage people, is to start looking at more of the keyboard operations for Visual Studio Code, because it's got so much that it can offer if you're just working off the keyboard and not relying on trying to click through menus. In fact, a lot of what the extensions provide to Visual Studio Code, you can't get to through menus. You need to use things like the command palette to get to anyway.
Yeah, and these things like the command palette, they really do become second nature now. When I want to go to a file, like Control-P, I don't go through the browser on the left. It's just straight there by searching the file name. Yeah, for sure. Were there any features that you wanted to mention but didn't quite have time for?
obviously extensions is something that I touched on briefly, and there's thousands of extensions out there. But there was one extension that I forgot to include that I think everyone, particularly if you're doing .NET, JavaScript, or Python development, should check out, and that's IntelliCode. IntelliCode, it's artificial intelligence assisted IntelliSense. So we're all familiar with IntelliSense if we're working with strongly typed language, where you type out your variable name and hit dot, and it, here's an alphabetized list of things that you might want to do next. What IntelliCode does is it's created models of code bases of particular languages by going through public repositories on GitHub and things like that, to then say, well, what is the most likely thing you would want to do from this particular variable? So if it's a string, it knows that, well, one of the most likely things that you want to do from there, will split, we'll get the length, so that'll actually fly up to the top. But then with IntelliCode, you can get it to analyze your own code base, so it understands the heuristics and the nuances of your code base. So the services and the factories that you might have defined, interfaces or classes, and how you use your own code base, so that it just means that you're typing less because it's trying along the lines of writing the code that you were intending to write anyway. You just hadn't typed fast enough. That was an extension I wanted to get to, and just ultimately it was too much other good stuff to cover off first.
There was so much. So much stuff in Visual Studio Code. Well, one kind of side question that I wanted to ask you is what's your stance? Because Visual Studio is so customizable. You showed Peacock, where you can customize different environments into having different colors around the side. What's your stance on like fonts and changing stuff like that?
And the theming. And really, everyone's going to have their own opinions on like what's the right theme, what's the right fonts. But for me, I like to try and go with something that has a bit of personality to it. Like I showed that towards the end, where I went to this like purple and blue and like cyberpunk, sort of like 1984 kind of theme. But there's a lot of fantastic themes out there, whether you're a dark theme user or a light theme user, that can give you an editor experience that will fit for the sorts of stuff that you're going to want to do. Something else I would encourage people to check out is the different icon packs. By default, Visual Studio Code doesn't really understand different file types. It has like some basic iconography in there, but there's some other ones out there that can help it, just so that as you're scanning through file lists and symbol lists and stuff like that, to identify things quite easily. The stuff that I like for the most of the talk, I was using the theme AYU, and that's the theme I tend to use for a lot of my day-to-day stuff. And every now and then I'll flip into my 1984 like synth pop style theme. I use the Cascadia Code Powerline font with font ligatures installed, so I get
ligatures. I was wondering if you were going to mention those.
Yeah, I get some of those unique symbols, like the way that it does like not equals, or because I do a bunch of F# development, the way that it shows piping operators and stuff like that. But if you're someone that prefers just like a straight monospaced font, then choose that, like pick that kind of stuff. I think that it's because it's so customizable, you can make it work the way that way you need it to work. Whether it is you just want the most simple, basic, light theme because you aren't a dark theme person. If you wanted to run it in Comic Sans, be my guest. Not my cup of tea, but you can totally run your editor as a Comic Sans text editor.
Yeah, for sure. Fantastic. Not sure if there's any other questions coming up, but I think I'm gotten through a lot of information here, so I think that's absolutely fantastic. Was there any final comments you wanted to bring up about Visual Studio Code?
Only that I think that it's something that people should definitely have as part of their tool chain, even if it isn't the primary editor that you're using. Check it out. Check out the remote extensions. Whether it is that you're doing development on WSL or you want to try out something like a dev container where you can containerize the development environment so that you can install all the standard tooling that you're going to need, the right versions of Node or .NET or whatever it might be. That kind of stuff can really simplify getting started on a project. If you're an open source developer, making it so that someone can just like drive by your project, pick it up, contribute, and not have to spend a lot of time setting up their environment for the way that you want them to set it up, you can give that to them. The more stuff that you can do with that and encourage people to have standards actually as part of the way your source control, the source repo that you've got, I think it's going to be the better for everyone that wants to work on a project with you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, you're using all of these little extensions that can just simplify things. Can make it so much better.
Indeed.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, thank you for your time, Aaron. This has been very enlightening. And I'm sure it's been very enlightening for all of our viewers. And thank you, viewers, for joining us at SSW and over the web. If you'd like to spend some more time, of course, we have more talks in any of the future rooms. Please continue to stick around. Aaron mentioned the other talk is going to be there. Maybe you'll see him in the chat. But I encourage you all to stay safe and have fun.
Well, thanks for having me on.